In 1978, archaeologists excavated a dry trench in South Dakota and uncovered 486 human skeletons piled atop one another. No coffins, no rituals, just shattered bones, crushed skulls, and unmistakable signs of mass scalping. They didn't die from disease. They weren't killed by a natural disaster. They were slaughtered, deliberately, systematically. An entire ancient community, erased in one horrific attack. No one survived. No one lived to tell the story. The massacre occurred sometime between 1325 and 1350 in what is now known as Crow Creek. Once a thriving native village along the Missouri River. They had homes, they farmed, they hunted, they built defenses, and then they vanished overnight. No legend remembers them. No written history records them. But the bones are still there, telling the story history tried to forget. A brutal purge, a total extermination, and a warning about the darkest side of humanity, when society collapses from within. This isn't Hollywood. This is real, buried in the heart of America. This is the Crow Creek Massacre. Part 2. Two tribes, one land. Before the fire lit up that fateful night, before the screams were buried beneath layers of clay, Crow Creek was a land of abundance. The Missouri River flowed endlessly, carrying silt and life. Along its high banks, two native cultures once laid foundations, not just with digging sticks, but with dreams of a fertile homeland. The first group, known as the Middle Missouri Tradition, arrived sometime after 900 AD. They spoke a Siouan language and are considered the ancestors of today's Mandan people. They built round earth lodges, wood-framed, clay-covered, clustered close to the river, like little domes sprouting from the ground. They lived off farming, hunting, and fishing. It was a peaceful community that thrived for centuries. Around 1150 AD, another group came, this time from the south, in what is now Nebraska. They spoke a Caddoan language, and archaeologists call them the initial coalescent culture, forebears of the Arikara. They chose higher ground near the edge of the bluffs and built over 55 houses, forming a planned village with signs of fortifications. Strangely, there's no direct evidence of conflict between the two groups. No burned structures, no mingled corpses. Perhaps they coexisted peacefully. Perhaps one group moved on, allowing the other to settle. But peaceful or not, the cohabitation didn't last, because one day, the village of the initial coalescent was surrounded, and every soul within it was erased from the map. No one survived to tell what happened. Only white bones remained, and blade marks that time has not yet erased. Part 3. Defense in the face of chaos. When archaeologists began excavating Crow Creek, they didn't just find human bones. They found an unfinished portrait of desperation. There had once been a defensive ditch dug around the village as a final line of resistance. But it was never completed. What remained suggested the villagers had started digging a new trench, wider, deeper, encircling their expanding settlement. They weren't training. They were preparing for war. Because they knew something was coming. Maybe they saw smoke rising from a nearby village. Maybe the scouts never returned. Maybe the skirmishes of the past had already sounded the alarm. Peace was over. But they didn't finish in time. The attack came before the defenses were ready. And that unfinished trench became their mass grave. Over 480 bodies killed and dumped into the ditch. No order, no burial items, no signs of resistance, no arrows fired, no survivors left to tell the story. This wasn't a raid for food. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't a hit and run. This was a purge, a calculated act of extermination, to wipe out an entire community, to turn homes into rubble, to turn human lives into blade marks on white bone. And the defensive trench, once meant to protect life, became an open grave for the entire village. Part 4. Every death was mutilated. When the skeletons of Crow Creek were unearthed, what horrified archaeologists wasn't just how many had died, but how they were killed. This wasn't just a massacre. It was a ritualized execution, brutal, systematic, and deliberate. Every death processed like part of a ceremony. Roughly 90% of the skulls bore signs of scalping, deep, unmistakable cuts sliced from forehead to crown. Many skulls showed broken teeth, missing jaws, severed tongues. Others had arms or legs hacked off, internal organs removed, bodies burned, flayed, treated like game animals after a hunt. Researchers confirmed these injuries weren't inflicted during combat. They were done after death or when victims were already incapacitated. This lends chilling weight to the theory that it was a ceremonial act of terror. And the most disturbing part, no one was spared. Men, women, the elderly, even children too small to lift a weapon, all bore the marks, with one grim distinction. The scalp cuts on children were often higher, as if the executioners couldn't be bothered to kneel. The deaths at Crow Creek weren't just about killing. They were a message written in blood, a warning, a humiliation, a way to etch fear into the memory of an entire region. Whoever dares to resist won't just die, they'll be stripped of their very dignity. Part 5. They starved before they died. Not all the deaths at Crow Creek happened in a single moment. Some had already begun dying long before the final spear was thrown. Not from weapons, but from hunger. When archaeologists and paleopathologists examined the skeletons, they noticed something disturbing. Bones were hollow, thin, fragile, weaker than normal. Many skulls showed signs of cribra orbitalia, tiny lesions above the eye sockets, a marker of severe iron deficiency. Pelvic bones and spinal columns bore porotic hyperostosis, another sign of chronic malnutrition, especially during growth. Worse still, the long bones of children revealed Harris lines, interrupted growth marks that speak of repeated cycles of famine. These were not brief hardships. These were waves of starvation, year after year. The entire Crow Creek population was smaller and shorter than their Araucara descendants, especially the women, likely because they worked more and ate less during scarcity. But one detail hit the archaeologists the hardest. Dog remains were buried among the humans, not as offerings, not as companions for the afterlife. They had eaten the dogs. The bones were smashed, butchered. The dogs had become the final meat source before the collapse. Crow Creek didn't just die by blade or arrow. They were already exhausted, sick, and starving. The massacre was simply the last blow, cruel, but perhaps inevitable. And when a community is forced to eat its own dogs to survive, perhaps their spirit had already died long before their bodies were thrown into the trench. Part 6. Traces of Wars Before the End. As anthropologists began closely examining the bones from Crow Creek, they uncovered a grim truth. Death hadn't come suddenly. It was the final note in a long, slow song of violence, written into the regrowth of bone. One skull bore the scar of an old scalping wound, but a thin layer of new bone had begun to grow back, evidence that this person had survived a previous attempt to be scalped. Another skull had a dent in the forehead from a blunt force trauma that had healed over time, leaving behind a thick ridge of scarred bone. And some leg bones still had stone arrowheads lodged inside, with the bone growing around them, as if the body had tried to absorb the wound with no surgery, no medicine, just pain and time. Crow Creek didn't die in peace. They lived in fear, their bodies engraved with reminders that death could come at any moment. Every man, woman, elder, and child was already a survivor of unending assaults. And then one day, the final assault came. There were no more chances to recover, no wounds left to heal. Only corpses remained, and a question carved into every fragment of bone. How many times can a community rise again, before it finally falls for good. Part 7. Who carried out the massacre? To this day, no one knows exactly who slaughtered over 480 people at Crow Creek. There are no written records, no surviving legends, but the bones still speak, and archaeologists, through blade marks, weapon fragments, and village layout, have slowly pieced together a chilling picture. The perpetrators may not have come from afar. The most credible theory, a rival group from the initial coalescent culture, close kin of the Crow Creek people, was responsible for the massacre. They weren't strangers. They may have traded together. They may have intermarried. But sometime in the 14th century, everything changed. It was an era of climatic crisis in the American Midwest, relentless drought, crop failures, population growing faster than food supplies. Each failed harvest pushed communities closer to famine's edge. And in that world, arable land, fresh water, and food became more valuable than gold. In a land without a central authority, those with weapons held the power. Smaller, weaker villages became easy targets. Crow Creek likely had fertile soil, a defensible position, and clean water. That made them a prime target, not out of hatred, but for resources. This wasn't a war between distant civilizations. It was an internal conflict between people who spoke the same language, shared the same ancestors, and practiced the same customs. Their killers, perhaps once friends, perhaps once neighbors, perhaps even once family. And that makes this massacre far more terrifying than any battle between strangers. Part 8. Burying the dead by the hundreds. After the massacre, silence fell over Crow Creek. No voices, no smoke from fires, just human bodies left to decay under the sun and wind, picked apart by animals, erased by time. No one came to mourn them. No incense, no grave goods, no rituals to guide their souls. They were not allowed to die as humans. Archaeologists discovered that the bodies were not buried immediately. Many skeletons were found disarticulated, bones no longer aligned in anatomical position. Some skulls were missing jaws. Limbs were pulled from torsos. These were signs that the corpses had lain exposed for days, maybe weeks, before someone, perhaps survivors, perhaps nearby villagers, gathered the remains and threw them into the unfinished trench. Inside the ditch, the human remains were piled in layers over 1.2 meters deep, jumbled together with no order. At the top, a thin layer of animal bones and scattered human fragments, possibly left behind, picked over by scavengers, were collected later and dumped in haste. This was no cemetery. No one came here to remember. No one returned to place a marker. It was a forced grave, a way to hide the aftermath of total annihilation, a period, a layer of dirt thrown over an entire culture. And when the final handful of soil was dropped, Crow Creek was no longer a village. It became a buried memory, an absence in the historical record, only filled centuries later by fragments of bone and unanswered questions. Part 9. The Fight Over Bones. More than 600 years after the massacre, in 1978, a team of modern archaeologists returned to the land of Crow Creek. Beneath the dry soil, they uncovered 486 human skeletons, still lying undisturbed in the defensive trench, as if no one had dared to disturb the pain buried there. To researchers, this was an irreplaceable trove of data, a window into prehistoric warfare, nutrition, disease, and the cultural history of native North America. They wanted to preserve the remains for long-term study, especially as new scientific methods were emerging every year. But to the Sioux and Arikara peoples, the direct descendants of the dead, those bones were not artifacts. They were ancestors, spirits, flesh and blood. They demanded the remains be reburied exactly where they were found, not stored in museums, not kept as study samples. The negotiations dragged on for months. Eventually, a compromise was reached. The remains would be buried in 5 mass graves, placed within the original excavation sites to avoid disturbing new ground. The reburials were accompanied by multiple ceremonies: a traditional Lakota rite, a Christian service, and a private, sacred ritual by the Arakara. It became the largest reburial in the history of American archaeology. Controversial in academic circles because future access was lost, but it marked a turning point in ethical practice. From that moment, Crow Creek, once forgotten, helped change the way America treated its own past. In response to this event, the United States Congress passed the NAGPRA Act in 1990, requiring museums to return human remains and sacred objects to indigenous tribes across the country. Part 10. A warning from silent bones. Crow Creek is not just a bloodstain in the prehistory of North America. It is a cold mirror reflecting human nature, a place where a community wasn't destroyed by foreign invaders, but by those who shared their blood, their language, and their ancestry. It's a story of collapse from within. When resources ran dry, when fertile land turned barren, when the climate grew erratic and harvests failed, neighborly trust fractured, and eventually the blade turned inward, not toward outsiders, but toward brothers. Crow Creek stands as brutal evidence. When society is thrown into crisis, famine, water shortage, population strain, even the smallest, most peaceful communities can unravel in blood and ash. What's even more terrifying is this: we forgot them. They are not in textbooks. No memorial was ever raised, but they are still there, beneath the dry soil of South Dakota, waiting for someone to hear their story. And when we look at our world today, with climate change, water shortages, social unrest, and global division, the warning from Crow Creek no longer feels like ancient folklore. Listen closely, because if we don't, the history we refuse to tell will rise again and remind us in the most painful way possible. Just like the bones buried beneath the earth, silent but never voiceless, Crow Creek is not just an archaeological lesson. It is a warning to the modern world. Today, we too stand at the same crossroads the people of Crow Creek once faced. Climate change is draining rivers and scorching harvests. Water crises are spreading. From California to Africa, inequality is deepening and trust between people is eroding fast. We may think we're different, more modern, more intelligent, but has human survival instinct truly changed? Or would just a little hunger, a little panic, be enough to break any society, just as Crow Creek once broke? If you find meaning in stories that were buried and forgotten, subscribe to the channel, share this video, and leave a comment to join the conversation, because history isn't just something to remember, it's something that warns us. And Crow Creek is still whispering,